Hey internets. So there's no denying that what happened on January 6, 2021 was a pretty stupid and pretty embarrassing display of some of the worst of humanity. Riots can be, in layman's terms, described as when a bunch of adults decide to act like toddlers throwing a temper tantrum, and the violence that ensues tend to cause hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars of property damage while accomplishing, well, absolutely nothing of note. This is one of the reasons why it's important to condemn this type of behavior on all sides of the political spectrum. The vast majority of riots cause unnecessary suffering and generally in the end just result in bad optics for the people that cause the riot, going against whatever cause they claim to believe in. Unfortunately, these bad optics can also sometimes be exploited by people on the opposing side for the sake of a political power grab through dishonest methods. And that's exactly what we see with the bizarre narrative of that the January 6th Capitol riot of 2021 was an actual serious coup attempt as an insurrection to overthrow the United States government. So in this video, I'm going to explain why this is an example of trying to make a mountain out of a molehill, which is an intellectually dishonest argument where events are greatly exaggerated, often as an attempt to play victim over a massively exaggerated wrongdoing in order to justify a heavily disproportionate response. The January 6th Capitol riot was many bad things, but calling it a coup is a really dishonest stretch of reality, and it's also completely inconsistent with the evidence of what actually happened. First off, before we even go anywhere, we must first start with forming an honest definition of what an insurrection is. This is extremely important because I recently saw a debate where Destiny tried to argue it was an insurrection while describing it as simply disruption of the peaceful transfer of power. This is a completely nonsensical definition, since technically, if the Magat simply went to the Capitol and loudly protested the election results and never did any proper damage or any rioting, but caused the vote count to be delayed for a few minutes due to them being annoying, then technically that would also still count as an insurrection. This was the main mistake made by Aydin in this debate with Destiny, was that she allowed him to get away with this crazy definition that basically lets him call January 6th an insurrection, even if the only thing the Trumpies did was stand there with their Trump signs and seethe. In fact, pretty much any protest or riot about the election results, such as the leftist Antifa riots that happened during Trump's term, could also be subjectively argued to be a disruption of the peaceful transfer of power. Or how about Russian collusion, which turned out to be a giant nothing burger, or as the Mueller report specifically stated, did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities, which is completely the opposite of many DNC claims, as well as the sophistry we saw in the media surrounding it. So by this definition, the DNC's Russia hoax also counts as a coup. So are all of them also disqualified from running in future elections? You can see how a subjective definition like this can quickly spiral out of control. So what would be a more honest definition of insurrection? Well, considering the fact that people, including Destiny, are trying to use this as justification for why the Trump store should not be allowed to run again, it probably makes the most sense to use the definition that is closely tied to their justification, which is the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which states that no one who has previously held office and engaged in insurrection against the United States can hold office again, which many of the people pushing the insurrection narrative are trying to call upon to justify barring Trump from rerunning for president. Now, this amendment was back in 1868, largely with the Civil War in mind. So the honest thing to do would be to use the definition of coup and insurrection that closely aligns with what they were thinking of at that time period, which is of course is a literal armed rebellion against the United States government in an attempt to actually overthrow it, not just cope and seethe about it. So what do you think they had in mind when writing this amendment? Well, the armed organized rebellion that was the Civil War, obviously. Or a hypothetical riot over election results? Yeah, like I said, molehill. And the Webster's Dictionary definition when looked at honestly reflects this: an act or instance of revolting against civil authority or an established government, with revolt clearly meaning an armed uprising. This reveals the first major fallacy of the insurrection narrative: equivocation. They are trying to use the definition of insurrection as imagined by people in the age of the Civil War, an actual real armed rebellion, and implying that it carries the same connotations as this new made-up definition of insurrection, where simply disrupting the democratic process counts as insurrection. This is both completely ridiculous and extremely dishonest, because it completely ignores the context of which the 14th Amendment was written. Well, since they want to compare this to the third section of that amendment so badly, let's just compare the two events. So in the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, on the Confederate side, there was a fighting force of about 1 million, nearly all of them armed, directly caused the deaths of about 365,000 members of the U.S. North, and cost 2 years' worth of GDP and expenditures. And in the Great Q Boomer freakout of January 6, 2021, there was an estimated 10,000 to 80,000 protest participants, with those who can be argued to be rioters estimated at over 2,000. The overwhelming majority brought protest signs and no guns. 5 deaths, with the only gunshot death being Ashley Babbitt, one of the rioters, and cost about $2,700,000 in damage. Yeah, When you place the molehill and mountain right next to each other, the utter insanity of this equivocation really lays itself bare. And what really puts the nail in the coffin of this insurrection molehilling is that these stats of January 6 are even less damaged than many of the BLM riots. The George Floyd protests, for instance, had 19 confirmed deaths and over $500 million in property damage costs. This also calls into question another big problem with the January 6 insurrection narratives. If the MAGA was really intended to overthrow the US government and forcibly install Donald Trump as some kind of permanent dictator or whatever, why the heck did most of them just bring pro-Trump protesting signs instead of their AR-15s? I know this might seem like an obvious argument to point out, but the biggest evidence that it wasn't an insurrection is honestly just the fact that if you look at the pictures and watch the footage, it's just blatantly not an insurrection. And they're telling you to don't believe your lying eyes, don't look at the numbers, instead read these reasons for why it was an insurrection from various partisan and corporate media pundits and other journos who, as we all know, have an excellent track record for their honesty. Seriously though, Trump supporters are some of the biggest rifle owners in the United States, and yet, instead of coming armed with them and ready to open fire on Congress, they instead just kind of screamed and looted and bashed random parts of the property with their Trump signs while wearing funny hats. And yet, we are supposed to believe that tens of thousands of people with the full intent of a coup to overthrow the government did this instead of bringing their rifles. Sure, some of them were found to have some concealed handguns on them or whatever, but not any more than what you would expect from Trump supporters just randomly walking around on the streets. So that's a cope. The reality is the journos pointing this out are just avoiding admitting the reality that the total firearm deaths caused by the Trumpers was 0. Yeah. Not even 1. That's not a number you see in an actual serious attempt at an insurrection. If 40,000 or so Trump supporters actually wanted to commit an actual armed insurrection to actually overthrow the US government, there is no way, no snowball's chance in hell, that their firearm deaths caused would be 0. And I've pointed this out to a few people before. The response I got was just because the insurrection was carried out unsuccessfully and incompetently doesn't mean it wasn't an insurrection. But this is just a ridiculous circular argument. Anything can be argued to be an insurrection attempt if you go by solipsistic reasoning like that. For example, say someone walks by the US Capitol and drops an apple on the ground. Stop right there, evildoer. You are engaged in insurrection against the United States government. But all I did was drop an apple. Aha, well, just because you did it incompetently and were unsuccessful doesn't mean you didn't try to commit an insurrection against the United States government. Just about anything can be plugged into this logic and be called an insurrection attempt. If you assume that it was an insurrection, you can then just use anything that they do under any circumstances as proof that it was an insurrection in order to prove that it was an insurrection by assuming it was an insurrection. This is a particular type of circular argument known as a Kafka trap. Now, of course, there is a massive gish gallop out there of other reasons for why it was an insurrection, which has been generated by the media, the January 6th committee, and that sham Soviet show trial. I've read through a lot of them and found nothing convincing. In fact, just the opposite. The idiotic and dishonest reasons I've seen only further prove that they're really just making a mountain out of a molehill, since the vast majority of them amount to meaningless nitpicks and similar dishonest definitions of what an insurrection is, and of course, terminal Trump derangement syndrome. Obviously, I can't touch on all of these reasons in a 10 to 15 minute Muh video, so what I'll do instead to top this off is I'll just focus on a few of the other arguments Destiny made in his debate with Aydin. The first of these is only taking Trump literally when it suited his position. Destiny takes Trump literally when Trump says, "fight like hell," but ignored him when Trump told the January 6th crowd to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard. It's impossible, of course, to know whether Trump himself actually believed anything he was saying without magical mind-reading powers, but you can't prove an insurrection based on unfalsifiable mind-reading again. And challenging the election results and claiming voter fraud doesn't fit the proper definition of insurrection either. If Trump was incorrect about those things, then it just means that what he was doing was stupid and wrong. And you can argue about that all you want, but it's a discussion for another day. Alas, everyone knows that the word fight doesn't automatically imply violence. Fight is used in sports, video games, and just about every other competition. People use fight in hyperbole all the time. To imply that phrase proves intent of insurrection is just insanely bad faith. The second is being wrong on riot control. Destiny was superficially correct that yes, police defending a building from rioters do need to occasionally retreat to a more defensible position, and yes, some of the rioters can be seen in footage pushing against the cops outside the building. However, the flaw in Destiny's logic lies in the simple fact that at no point does it make any sense to let them into said building. Having watched some of the Portland, Oregon riots in person and having physically witnessed how riot control works, you generally chaperone them away from what you're trying to protect. You definitely don't chaperone them into it. It's obviously not easier to defend the Capitol against being infested with rioters by letting said rioters infest the Capitol. That is just an insane argument to make. Now, it would be a different story, of course, if the Trumpies were brandishing guns and forcing the cops to let them in at gunpoint. Then sure, I suppose that may be a case where it would make sense. But if you watch watch the video of the event, it becomes blatantly obvious that the exact opposite happened. Cops appear completely nonchalant as people calmly walked by with American flags and Trump signs. No guns. To say that the police are being forced by the rioters to do this is just pure gaslighting. But don't take my word for it. I'll link some additional footage in my sources list in the description below, and you can be the judge. The third error was just inconsistent reasoning from Destiny about the numbers. He implied there was not a significant pushback from the cops because they only shot one person when Aydin complained about them shooting Ashley Babbitt. Technically though, Destiny was correct on his point because only shooting one person in a small hallway isn't really that much of a deterrence. The problem is it was also a fallacy of double standards. Why is it okay to point out the low numbers on the side of those defending the Capitol on January 6th to prove a point about the force being utilized, but also okay to completely ignore the fact that the numbers from the Trump side were also low, which, by the way, need I remind you, the number of people that the MAGA got shot and killed was a nice big fat zero. Such insurrection, much wow. But in conclusion, the main problem overall with the January 6th was an insurrection narrative mainly boils down to the severely flawed definition of insurrection being used by all the sophists out there. I know that makes things boring since it's effectively just semantics, but that really is the main error in this narrative. If we want to discuss whether or not a bad thing occurred, the most important thing is to clearly define what that bad thing specifically is. And if you want to call upon a law written over 100 years ago to make your case, you need to make a good faith attempt to understand the meaning of the words as they were written and intended by those who wrote them. Anything else is pure 100% sophistry. The harsh truth is, if you were to resurrect the Congress of 1868 and ask them if challenging an election result or protesting votes you believe to be fraudulent counts as what they meant by insurrection when writing the 14th Amendment, chances are pretty good that they're going to look at you like you are some kind of clown. And that's what this narrative is really all about. It's another manifestation of clown world where objective truth does not exist, and thus every minor wrongdoing can be argued to be the worst, horrible, big mountain thing ever, by simply torturing definitions and shifting goalposts until you get your way. I am not a Republican, but it is blatantly obvious that the Democrats here are simply engaging in semantical word games to redefine what happened in a context that allows them to ban their current 2024 election frontrunner opponent from the ballot. It's pathetic, and everyone with a shred of intellectual integrity can see it. Anyways, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, or tip me on Ko-Fi, or comment and all that good stuff. Till next time.